For us is now we are in recording. For us is the Turkish Neuropsychoanalysis Working Group, study group, to have Prof.Mark Solms with us tonight. We are very excited to hear about his latest book. I would like to say hello especially to Professor Barış Korkmaz, Professor Işıl Vahip, and of course, the translator of Mark Solms and Oliver Turnbull's seminal book, The Brain and the Internal World. Professor Hakan Atalay is also with us. And now I'm going to leave the word to Gökçe Özkarar, our president of the Turkish Neuropsychoanalysis Study Group. Please, Gökçe.
Thank you, Gamze, for your kind statement. I think we are the president of this group altogether. Hi to everyone. As the Turkish Neuropsychoanalysis Group, we are happy to welcome you today to listen to the Hidden Spring. We thank Professor Solms for his kindness to accept our invite. We also convey our thanks to Başkent University Psychiatry Department and Çınar Psychotherapy Center for their collaborations in the organization of this event. Since 2010, this is the 5th time that we are hosting Solms to meet with the Turkish audience, and this time also international audience. We are sure most of the participants here are already familiar with his wonderful studies. However, for the newcomers to the neuropsychoanalysis world, I would like to briefly introduce you, Mark. Professor Solms is the Director of Neuropsychology at the Neuroscience Institute of the University of Cape Town. He is the Founder Director of the International Society for Neuropsychoanalysis. He is a member of the New York, British, and South African Psychoanalytical Societies. He has published 350 articles and chapters and 8 books. The masterpiece, Brain and the Inner World, written by Solms and Turnbull, has been translated into Turkish in 2012 by Professor Hakan Atalay, a member of our group, who is also today with us. And Mark Solms' most recent book, Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness, will also appear next year in Turkish translation. And today we are lucky to listen from Mark about the hidden spring, the brainstem. I will cut my words short. Yes, Mark, as always, we are with you listening.
Thank you both. I'm very glad to be here. When I say here, I'm not quite sure where that is, but I wish I was there. It really is the case that Istanbul is one of my favorite places in the world. So when you say this is the 5th time I've spoken to you, the last 4 times I was there in Istanbul, and I look forward to the next opportunity to do that again in person.
The 4th time you were in Ankara actually, but online. At the 57th,
oh, is that so?
At the 57th okay. National Psychiatric Congress.
Oh, that's correct. Well spotted. And the first time I came, I think I wasn't speaking to the neuropsychoanalyst. I was speaking to a physiology seminar there. But anyway, here we go. So I'm going to tell you about the main argument of this book, The Hidden Spring. I'm going to do it as succinctly as I can. Obviously, you can't summarize a whole book in less than an hour. But I know what I'm going to say, so I'm much more interested in the question session that will come afterwards. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen. And find my little pointer. There it is. Okay. So here is the famous hard problem of consciousness as articulated by David Chalmers. He says, what makes the hard problem hard and almost unique is that it goes beyond problems about the performance of functions. To see this, note that even if we have explained the performance of all the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, there may still remain a further unanswered question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? A simple explanation of the functions leaves this question open. Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? So that's the hard problem. Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? So I've put that in big letters so that we can all be clear that this is the problem that I'm going to address in this brief presentation. Just to give you a clearer, simpler illustration of what Chalmers is saying, he's saying all the information processing that makes up our mental life could, in theory, go on without consciousness. You could model it all in a computer or a robot, what they call philosophical zombies, which could perform all the same functions in theory as our brain performs, and yet it wouldn't have any inner experience. So the question is, what does this inner experience add? We know that it is possible to model the kinds of functions that the human brain performs in computerized form. There are many computers that are as intelligent as us in some respects, in fact, even more intelligent than us in some respects. And even your cell phone can perform the sorts of functions that your brain performs. Your cell phone has memory, your cell phone has perception, your cell phone even has some executive functions, it has some decision-making processes. So what Chalmers is asking us is, if the cell phone can do all of this without consciousness, if computers can do all of this without experience, then why doesn't our brain do it without experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? Now, Chalmers is not the first person to ask this question. He built directly on the work of Tom Nagel, who wrote the following many years ago. He said, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism, something it is like for the organism. And he went on to say, if we acknowledge that a physical theory of mind must account for the subjective character of experience, we must admit that no presently available conception gives us a clue about how this could be done. So that's what I hope to do in this little talk. I want to give us a clue about how this could be done. So let me again make clear what the problem is that we're facing, what we're confronting, what we're addressing here, in the words of Tom Nagel. It is why and how is there something it is like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism. That's another way of putting the hard problem. Now, I must say, I have some sympathy for the views of Tom Nagel and David Chalmers. These questions that they ask, I think, are very legitimate questions. When I first studied neuropsychology in the mid-1980s, I was taught things like this, what I have on the screen right now. This is the information processing that constitutes our cortical vision. Here's a little map of where in the cortex all of this goes on, although this is a monkey. It's much the same as in a human being. And here's an information processing flowchart showing all of the complicated stuff that goes on when we process visual information. And when I was a student and learned this sort of thing, I asked myself the question, but where is the subject? Where is the experiencer of all this information processing? Where in this flowchart is the actual something it is like to have visual experience, to perceive the quality of the color red as opposed to the color blue, and so on. Frank Jackson, another philosopher, writing in between the two quotations I had on the screen, the one by David Chalmers and the earlier one by Tom Nagel, Frank Jackson formulated the seriousness of this problem in what has become famous as the knowledge argument. And I think it conveys very well the gravity of the issue. He says we must imagine a visual neuroscientist named Mary, who knows everything about what I have on the screen here. She knows all about this stuff. She knows all about that stuff, everything that there is to know about the physiology and the physics of vision, all the functional mechanisms involved. But I'm saying this story in a simplified form, but Mary is blind. So even though she has all this knowledge, she knows how the function of vision operates, she knows about all of its mechanisms, she has never experienced vision. And now Jackson asks us to imagine that fortunately the gift of sight is suddenly bestowed upon her. And so for the first time in her life, she actually sees. And Jackson's point is, at that moment, she will learn something utterly new about vision. She will learn what it is like to see. She will learn what blueness and redness are like, the qualities of visual experience. And his point is that none of that was contained in these diagrams. None of that was contained in these functional mechanistic accounts of how vision operates at an information processing level. And therefore, it seems that either you could say, it seems that these mechanistic accounts of how our cognition works do not require experience, or you could say that these mechanistic accounts do not explain the experience. The experience seems to exist in some other domain, something beyond our ordinary cognitive scientific way of going about explaining things. That's a very serious problem. That is why it's called the hard problem. How are we to fit experience into our ordinary way of doing science? Now, the problem is compounded by the fact, which again I learned at university already when I was a student, that most of our cognitive functions can in fact go on unconsciously. Just as I said to you earlier about computers and cell phones, that they are able to perceive and remember and make decisions, so too our cortex is able to perceive and remember and make decisions without consciousness being attached. As the title of this famous paper by John Killstrom so succinctly puts it, it's perfectly possible to have perception without awareness of what is perceived and learning without awareness of what is learned. In other words, it's perfectly possible to have cognition without awareness of that cognition. So it's not only that these artificial devices like computers and phones can process information in much the same way as the human brain does unconsciously, but the human brain itself processes all this information in very large part unconsciously. So I think that the question that David Chalmers posed, why doesn't all this human brain information processing go on in the dark, is made all the more telling. The point he makes is all the more telling in light of the facts that are summarized in the title of this review paper. Now, against this background, I want to introduce a statement by our Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis. Not only the founder of psychoanalysis, but in fact, the founder of the idea that most of our cognition goes on unconsciously, that human mental processing is not intrinsically conscious. The founder of psychoanalysis, the discoverer of the very large extent of the unconscious processing that goes on in human cognition, had the following thing to say. He said, it's surely of the essence of an emotion that we should be aware of it. That is, that it should become known to consciousness. Thus, the possibility of the attribute of unconsciousness would be completely excluded as far as emotions, feelings, and affects are concerned. Isn't that a remarkable statement? The discoverer of the unconscious says that when it comes to emotions, feelings, and affects, they are intrinsically conscious things. Now, unfortunately, different people mean different things by these words, emotions, feelings, and affects. And some people argue that we can have unconscious affects and unconscious emotions. I'm not going to go into all of the reasons for that, but I will just point out that I am using the word in the sense that I've emboldened here. I'm speaking about feelings. I'm building on what Freud said, and I'm focusing on this word, namely that you cannot have a feeling if you don't feel it. Feelings are intrinsically conscious things. And so everything I'm going to say to you now builds upon this observation, this remark of Freud's, this insight of Freud's, that unlike the rest of mental functioning, there is one aspect of mental functioning which is intrinsically conscious, and that is that aspect that we call feelings. So to put it very succinctly, perhaps the human subject, the experiencer of mental life, is not a cognitive something, but rather an affective something. Perhaps the core, the source of feeling, the subject that does the feeling, perhaps this is a affective subject. So let's go back to Chalmers. Chalmers says, I'm not going to read all of this, but he says much the same thing as he said in the quotation I read to you earlier. And he ends by saying, there is no cognitive function that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. So this is, as I say, what he was saying earlier. It's all about this cognitive functions do not necessarily have to be conscious, and explaining the performance of those functions, none of them can we say about them in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. And I think that the problem here is with the word cognitive. Chalmers is talking about cognitive functions. If we were to change his statement so that he says there is no affective function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience, I think that statement becomes unsustainable because it does not apply to feelings. I would say in advance that an explanation of the function of feeling will automatically explain experience because feeling is intrinsically experienced. So if you're explaining what feeling does, you're explaining what experience does. You can't explain feeling, the function of feeling, without it including this property of it being like something to experience the feeling. The whole point of a feeling is that you feel it. And as I said earlier, please remember, this does not apply to cognition, to learning, to perception. All of those things can go on without any inner feel. So let me now move to the main argument that I'm wanting to present in the brief time available to us. I've said to you that the cortex and its cognitive functions are not intrinsically conscious. That little information flow chart that I showed you focusing on visual information processing applies to the whole of the cortex. The cortex is able to do all of these perceptual functions, learning functions, executive functions, without for the most part, without them being conscious. But can we say that about the brain stem, and in particular, the reticular activating system of the brain stem? This we've known since 1948 is the source of consciousness. It was a great surprise when it was discovered all those years ago that a tiny little incision made here separating the reticular activating system from the whole of the forebrain with its cortex has the result that all of the cortical functions lose their consciousness. All of the cognitive functions lose their consciousness. In fact, the animal, because it was animals in whom this experiment was done by Magoon and Maruzzi, cats in particular, they fell into a coma. And we've known since then that damage to these reticular activating structures reliably produces coma in all vertebrates, including us. And in fact, you can make a lesion as small as 2 millimeters cubed, the size of a match head, in the parabrachial complex in human beings. I don't say you can make a lesion because, of course, we don't do it deliberately, but in naturally occurring brain lesions, there's an area in the parabrachial complex, part of the reticular activating system, just 2 cubic millimeters large, which when that is damaged, it reliably leads to coma in human beings. So we've long known since the 40s that this part of the brain is the source of consciousness, in the sense that it powers up the cortex, and that the cortex is not able to perform cognitive functions consciously unless they are activated by the reticular brain stem. The way that we understood that when it was first discovered was that it was like a power supply, that the reticular activating system was like an electrical power source of, say, for example, a television set. That the cortex is like the television set. It does all the televisual processing, but of course, it is a prerequisite for it to be able to do its televisual thing, that it has to be plugged into a power source. It would be absurd on that view to say that really the source of television is the power source, is the electrical socket in the wall. That's how we understood the findings of Magoon and Maruzzi, that it wasn't really consciousness, was only at the level of consciousness, some sort of quantitative dimension of how much consciousness, sort of volume control, if you will, comes from the brainstem, but the contents of consciousness and the qualities of consciousness. And remember, we're speaking about that, this inner field, the actual something it is like of consciousness, its content and its quality. According to classical teaching, that is what the cortex provides. And of course, it has to be plugged in at the wall. And it is precisely that view that I'm going to argue tonight is incorrect. And I'm not the first person to argue this. It was argued by our dear late colleague and founding co-chair of the Neuropsychoanalysis Society, Jaak Panksepp. He was the first to seriously put forward the view that the reticular activating system does not provide a mere power source, a mere quantitative, contentless prerequisite for consciousness, but rather that what is contributed by this part of the brain has a quality and a content of consciousness, and that quality and content is affect. And here's some of the evidence for that conclusion. If the cortex was necessary for the qualities and contents of conscious experience, then total removal of the cortex should result in coma, should result in a loss of consciousness, loss of the quality and content of consciousness. At the very least, it should result in a persistent vegetative state. In other words, in blank wakefulness, no content and no quality. But I must say, I actually think, what could blank wakefulness, what does that even mean? But according to the classical theory bequeathed to us by Magoon and Maruzzi and followed by the mainstream of cognitive neuroscience for decades since then, right to the present day, that this is what the upper brainstem is providing, some sort of blank wakefulness without content and without quality. So if that were true, let's see what happens if there's no cortex. Here is the condition called hydranencephaly. This is a child, a little girl. Here's her brainstem, it's perfectly intact, and she has no cortex. So she should be in a coma or in a persistent vegetative state, but she's not. Here she is. She wakes up in the morning, she goes to sleep at night. In that sense, she's conscious during the day, during wakefulness. But much more importantly, her consciousness is not blank. It has a content, it has a quality. She is responsive emotionally. that's the crucial point. Here you see her baby brother is placed on her lap, and she responds by going, ah, she likes it. There's an emotional response. I want to draw your attention to the fact that persistent vegetative state is defined by non-responsive wakefulness. And here you can see with your own eyes her response. And the response is affective. She has no cortex. She cannot possibly be cognitively processing what's going on because the seat of cognition is absent in her brain. She has only a brain stem, and yet she's conscious and emotionally responsive and responsive in a situationally appropriate way. At this point, many people ask, but how can she respond to a stimulus that she can't even receive? And the point is, she does receive the information. She receives the information of her baby brother being placed on her lap unconsciously. Because just as happens with vision in this diagram, vision normally sends information via the thalamus to the cortex. The same applies to almost all of our perceptual modalities, apart from smell. It doesn't work in quite the same way. But touch, so that feeling, that not the feeling, rather the information that the baby has been placed on her lap, and the visual input that the baby has been placed on her lap, she can't see it cortically. She doesn't have the tactile and visual information cortically. But there's a second pathway that goes to the superior colliculi here in the brainstem, where that information is received unconsciously. And then the emotional brainstem responds consciously, affectively, just with raw feeling to this unconsciously received visual and tactile information. So in the complete absence of cognitive consciousness, or even the very possibility of cognitive consciousness, we find that there is still a subject there. There is still something it is like to be this little girl. And that something that it is like is affect. It's a raw affective feeling. And the evidence therefore shows that that must be generated here. It must be generated in the reticular activating system and the periaqueductal gray, which is right next to the superior colliculi in the brainstem. And I must point out that this doesn't apply only to that one little girl that you saw. It applies to the vast majority of these kids with no cortex. Here's another child with no cortex whatsoever. And as you can see, she's conscious. And as you can see, she's emotionally conscious. And she responds with all of the basic emotions, and she does so in situationally appropriate ways. Now, of course, the problem arises, and let me assure you, my colleagues all point this out to me repeatedly. How do you know that this child is conscious? Maybe she's a zombie, to go back to the phrase that I used earlier, Chalmers's phrase that, you know, you can have a machine that behaves as if it's conscious because it has all of the functionality. But how do you know that there's anybody at home? How do you know that there's something it is like to be this girl? Well, the reason that they say we don't know what it's like to be her is because she can't speak. Just like our pet dogs and cats can't speak, just like newborn babies can't speak. And we are therefore expected on the basis of this argument to cast doubt on whether or not they are conscious. It implies that if you're not verbal, you're not conscious, which is of course absurd. But the argument that they make is if you can't report your conscious experience, then we don't know that you have conscious experience. By the way, a philosophical zombie could report conscious experience without having any conscious experience. So I don't find this a particularly strong argument. But nevertheless, that's the argument that is made in the mainstream of cognitive neuroscience right to this day. We cannot know what it is like, or even if there is anything it is like to be these children who, for all the world, by their behavior, display affective, emotional feelings. So the only way we can get around this is to look to other evidence in human subjects who do have intact cortex by using different methods to see if the upper brainstem is really where feeling is generated. Is it generated in the upper brainstem? Because remember, in these cases, that's all they have is brainstem. There's no cortex. So one way of doing that is to stimulate the brainstem, stimulate the reticular activating system in human subjects who have cortex and can tell us what happens if you stimulate those nuclei that comprise the reticular activating system and periaqueductal gray. This is the only way we can address these things scientifically. We must make a testable hypothesis. We must make a falsifiable prediction. The prediction is if you stimulate those structures, then it should produce a raw affect. So let's see what happens if we test that hypothesis. Here is the substantia nigra. It is one of the nuclei of the reticular activating system. And I'm just giving you one example. I could give you many, many, many examples of deep brain stimulation experiments, which of course are done for clinical reasons, not experimental reasons. They're done in patients in whom, for clinical reasons, we have to put deep brain stimulators into their brain stem. Here is just one example in one case of what happens when this particular part of the reticular activating system was stimulated. It's a 65-year-old woman who's never had any psychiatric history. The stimulator was put in for the treatment of Parkinson's disease. It was aimed at something called the subthalamic nucleus, which is not part of the reticular activating system, but it went a little deeper than intended into the substantia nigra. And this is what happened to her. The patient's face expressed profound sadness within 5 seconds. 5 seconds. Although still alert, the patient leaned to the right, started to cry, and verbally communicated feelings of sadness, guilt, uselessness, and hopelessness, such as, I'm falling down in my head. I no longer wish to live, to see anything, hear anything, feel anything. When asked why she was crying and if she felt pain, she said, "No, I'm fed up with life. I've had enough. I don't want to live anymore. I'm disgusted with life. Everything's useless, always feeling worthless. I'm scared in this world." When asked why she was sad, she replied, "I'm tired. I want to hide in a corner. I'm crying over myself, of course. I'm hopeless. Why am I bothering you?" The depression, and you can only call it depression, what I've described, disappeared less than 90 seconds after stimulation was stopped. For the next 5 minutes, the patient was in a slightly hypomanic state, and she laughed and joked with the examiner, playfully pulling his tie. She recalled the entire episode. Stimulation at other sites did not elicit this psychiatric response. In other words, when they stimulated the originally intended site outside of the reticular activating system, you didn't get this response. And the patient kindly agreed to allow a double-blind trial where both places were stimulated without her knowing where the stimulator had been placed. And every time it was placed, or at least it was switched on again in the reticular activating system, the depression within seconds was switched on again. So the prediction from the hypothesis that feeling is generated in and by the reticular activating system and its adjacent periaqueductal gray, the prediction is confirmed by this other method, which gets around the problem of us not knowing what it's like to be a girl without cortex. Let's look at another method, positron emission tomography. If you scan the brain of somebody in an intense emotional state, according to the hypothesis that the emotion is generated in the brain stem, you would expect to find that the activation, that is to say the area of highest metabolic activity, should be in the brain stem. If it were in the cortex that the conscious qualities and contents of feelings were being experienced, then you would expect these intense affective states to lead to intense arousal and activation of cortex. So here's what we see. This is a positron emission tomography study done by our colleague Antonio Damasio, who, following in the footsteps of Jaak Panksepp, has come to the same conclusion that I've come to. He shows that in joyous states, angry states, sad states, fearful states, all of them, when these intense experiences of sadness and anger and happiness and fear are imaged, where the activation is not in the cortex, but rather in the brain stem. It's almost entirely subcortical, and the epicenter is down here in the brainstem. Look at the cortex. It really is not where affects are generated. And another line of evidence shows the same thing. Namely, if you manipulate pharmacologically the neuromodulators that are sourced in the reticular activating system, neuromodulators like dopamine and serotonin and noradrenaline, form the main targets of our mainstream psychiatric medications, so that antidepressants modulate serotonin, antipsychotics modulate dopamine, some anti-anxiety drugs modulate noradrenaline. If these chemicals were supplying merely power, in other words, quantity, in other words, a level of consciousness and no content and no quality, then only anesthetists would be interested in this part of the brain. But in fact, psychopharmacologists manipulate the chemistry of these systems every day in order to alter affective states, emotional states, feeling states of their patients. So all of these lines of evidence converge on the conclusion, the main conclusion that I'm wanting to convey to you, that consciousness, the core, the foundation, the elemental basis of all consciousness, the so-called power supply of the reticular activating system, where just the smallest amount of damage leads to an obliteration of all consciousness. That's why I'm saying this is the foundation of consciousness, that this foundation, this source of consciousness in the upper brain stem has a quality and a content, and that is affect. Therefore, I'm arguing that affect, that is to say feeling, the basis of emotional life, that it is the foundational, elemental, basic form of consciousness. And remember, the whole function of this part of the brain is consciousness. Unlike this part of the brain, the cortex, the main function of which is information processing, or doing all of these cognitive gymnastics, which do not require consciousness for them to go on. They can go on in the dark, hence the hard problem. This part of the brain, its whole function, it's what it intrinsically does is generate consciousness. That's what it's there for. And now, as I've said to you, we recognize that that form of consciousness is affective. This is why I think that in trying to solve the hard problem, we've been looking in the wrong place. It is no surprise that the question is so perplexing. Why doesn't all this cognitive cortical information processing go on in the dark without any inner field? Because it can, and it does. But this part of the brain, which is the actual source of consciousness, which is generating feelings, it would be most surprising if the part of the brain that generates feelings could generate feelings without them feeling like anything. So I'm saying that's where we should be looking. If we want to understand the mechanism, the functional mechanism of consciousness, in other words, if we want to solve the hard problem, then we should be looking to the brainstem and to feeling, not to the cortex and to things like vision. Vision can happily go on in the dark. So what then is the functional mechanism of feeling? Well, we believe, and when I say we, again, we're building on the work of our great friend and colleague Jaak Panksepp, and also on Antonio Damasio, who followed in his footsteps, when we say that the functional mechanism of affect is homeostatic, that basically we have homeostatically viable bounds. We have to remain within certain physiological ranges, and if we move out of that range, then there is a problem. It's an error, and we have to correct that error by getting back into that range. So, for example, our core body temperature must be roughly between 36.5 and 37.5 degrees Celsius. And if we move out of that range, then we are in danger of losing our lives. You get too hot, you die. You get too cold, you die. The viable bounds for the human organism are between 36.5 and 37.5 degrees. So you have to be there. And across many physiological parameters, that is how homeostasis works. Homeostasis ensures that deviations away from our viable bounds are corrected, and we move back into those viable bounds. Now, when you get too hot, it feels unpleasant. Or if you get too cold, it feels unpleasant. And on this theory, that is the function of feeling. The function of feeling is to allow the organism to register its own organismic state subjectively, to actually register how am I doing within this scale of values. The scale of values being that it is good to survive and bad not to survive. And the way in which the organism registers this goodness or badness, this value, is through feeling. And unpleasant feelings are bad and pleasant feelings are good, because unpleasant feelings predict your demise and pleasant feelings predict your survival. On this theory, that is what feelings are for. That is the functional mechanism of feeling. They enable the organism to register its own state in relation to this existentially meaningful set of values, namely, as I say, that survival is good and dying is bad. This word uncertainty, I'm going to explain now, with reference to the fact that not all homeostats in the body function consciously. There are many homeostats, like, for example, blood pressure regulation, which happens unconsciously. So the question that I'm now wanting to address, which is actually the crucial question, is why does this homeostatic regulation of our viable bounds, why must it be felt? What does the feeling add? Remember, that is the crucial question when Chalmers says, why doesn't it go on in the dark? What does the feeling do? What does it do causally, mechanistically? What is it for? What does it add? And I'm going to do so by reference to respiratory control. Respiratory control normally goes on unconsciously. It's homeostatic. It's the measurement of your blood gases, of the ratio of oxygen to carbon dioxide. There's a viable range, and your breathing, which happens automatically, is making sure that you remain within that viable range. And so now let's look at the point at which you become aware of respiratory control. Why do we become aware of respiratory control? Let me give you the example of you being in a carbon dioxide filled room. Suddenly you're in an unexpected situation. It's a crisis. Now suddenly breathing becomes conscious because you're aware that you are short of oxygen, that there's an excess of CO2, there's a deficiency of oxygen. Why should it be that at that moment you become consciously aware of what we call respiratory distress or suffocation alarm, air hunger, the need to breathe suddenly forces itself dramatically into consciousness in the form of a feeling. Why it does so on this theory, on the theory that I'm articulating in this book, is that now you're in an uncertain situation. Unlike the normal, automatic, entirely predictable business of ordinary respiratory control, when you move into a state of uncertainty for which you do not have a reflex, where you have to make choices, you've never been in a burning building before, never let this particular burning building. You don't have any prediction, any automatic reflex to tell you what to do. So you have to feel your way. That's what feeling does. You feel your way through the situation. If you go up, if the oxygen level is worse there, then you will feel more respiratory distress. If you go down and the oxygen supply is better there, then you will feel some relief, as opposed to increasing distress, you'll have decreasing distress. And this tells you what to do. This enables you to make choices in situations of uncertainty. And this is an enormous adaptive advantage. So on this theory, that is what feeling is for. Feeling enables the organism to know how it's doing here and now in uncertain situations so that it can make choices. Choice is absolutely fundamental to what consciousness is for. And choice has to be grounded in a value system. There has to be a good choice and a bad choice. And I told you already what the value system is that we're talking about. It's the basic value system that underpins the whole of natural selection. And this adaptive advantage, this thing that creatures who are conscious are able to do, is to survive in uncertain, unpredicted situations. And God knows there are many of those in life. By feeling your way through the situation, palpating whether this is better or worse, and the palpating is done by feeling. So I can extrapolate, I can elaborate a lot more, but we don't have time. Therein lies the essence of feeling. A feeling is an intrinsically subjective state. It's the organism registering its own state. It's an intrinsically valent state. In other words, there's a goodness and a badness, and it is intrinsically qualitative. And the quality arises from the fact that we have multiple needs. Remember, I said we have a multiplicity of these homeostats. They have to be treated as categorical variables. They can't be reduced to a common denominator. You can't say, you know, I have 3 out of 10 of hunger and 7 out of 10 of thirst. That makes 10 out of 20 of total needs, so I'll only drink, I won't eat. You know, it's, or the same you could say about sleep or whatever. Each one of these homeostatic needs has to be met in their own right. They're not reducible to a continuous variable. They're not reducible to a common denominator. They therefore have to be treated as categorical variables. And the distinction between categorical variables is qualitative. That's where quality comes in. The animal has to feel, us animals who are capable of feeling consciously, we have to register not only things are going badly, but in what way are they going badly? So that hunger feels different from suffocation alarm, which feels different from fear, which feels different from the need to urinate and so on. Each one of these affects has its own distinct quality. And that is because they are necessarily categorical variables. So there I have described for you all of the essential functional features of a feeling, that it is subjective intrinsically, it's the animal's own state. It is valence, it has quality, it has value, existential value, what is more, to the organism, for the organism, and it has quality. It is intrinsically qualitative. So the mechanism, the functional mechanism of feeling just is experienced. And so here we come back to that question that we posed at the outset, the one based on the way that Nagel had put it. Why and how is there something it's like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism? That's why, what I've just explained earlier. Think about this question as posed by Chalmers. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by experience? Why doesn't all this information processing go on in the dark, free of any inner field? So I say again, that it's understandable that this question was asked in relation to cortical vision, but it is not a reasonable question in relation to the function of feeling. Why doesn't all this feeling go on in the dark, free of any feel? It makes no sense. The very mechanism, the very function, the very purpose of the processing that we call affective is to enable the organism to experience it, and the experiencing does something. It underwrites choice, and it enables the organism to survive in uncertain situations. So that's the main argument that I wanted to convey. I'm winding down now. I'm heading toward the end. If you've understood everything that I've said to you this far, then I've succeeded in my almost main aim. My main aim is to persuade you, but my almost main aim is to make clear to you what I'm arguing. I can only hope that I've been able to persuade you that the argument is coherent and reasonable are the conclusions. I'm going to end now with a rather more difficult part of the talk, And that's why I'm drawing a line here and saying, if you've understood everything I've said to you so far, that's what really matters. If you believe what you've heard so far, all the better. This last bit is just sort of like dessert or after dinner drinks. Okay, here comes. Now, if the functional mechanism of homeostasis is understandable in the ordinary mechanistic language of natural science, then it should be possible to reduce that mechanism to an equation. There should be some way in which we can reduce it to laws, that this is how homeostasis works. And I was very struck in 2013 when I read a paper by this brilliant colleague, Carl Friston, a paper that he published in 2013 called Life as We Know It, which basically reduced homeostasis to an equation. It explained how self-organizing systems, that is like us, in ordinary natural scientific mechanistic language, how the self-organization that we call homeostasis, in other words, the regulation of our own viable states, how it all works. And basically what Friston argued in that is that the system has to separate itself. This is the system. This is not the system. The system has to separate itself from its environment so that it can regulate temperature or blood gases or whatever within this bubble. And within that bubble, it has to have some internal model of what it needs to do. He calls it a predictive model, some internal model of what must I do if I sense on the surface of the system, there are sensory states. In other words, like your cell phone has, like a little camera, it's a mechanistic thing. It's sensing, that is to say, registering the state. If you're registering here what your temperature is, then you have to have a prediction as to what you must do through your motor states in the outside world in order to bring about the sensory state that you need to be in, namely something like 37 degrees. So I'm outside of that. Therefore, my predictive model says, do this action that will bring you back to where you need to be. So that's the sort of most basic way in which homeostats work. They all have receptors and effectors, and they have a control center. That's how they work. Now, the control center is called a predictive model in this model of Friston's, and this introduces the possibility of error, of prediction errors, where things do not work out as expected. So this is what he explained to us in the 2013 paper, that the predictive model predicts that's what I must do to bring about this sensory state. And then there's a comparison between the actual sensory state and the predicted sensory state, and that is a measure of prediction error. And prediction errors enable the system to update its predictive model, in other words, to learn. And in this way, it remains viable. So this is more than just reflex, it's learning from its errors and able to change what it does. And you can see why this is so important, given everything that I've explained to you about uncertain situations. And so Friston reduced that mechanism, and you can see it's no reason to believe that it should be difficult to reduce that mechanism to a lawful equation. And so when I saw that he had done that, I asked him, recognizing that homeostasis is in terms of Jaak Panksepp and Antonio Damasio's and other people's work, which I was completely convinced by, on the basis of the sort of evidence I just showed you. I said, well, then it should be possible for us to extend your equation about homeostasis and turn it into an equation which mechanistically explains how consciousness works, or how feeling works, feeling being the rudimentary form of consciousness. And so that's what we did in that paper that we wrote together in 2018. And it all revolves around precision. So the system can act and it can represent the world. If there's prediction error, it can either change what it's doing, or it can change what it predicts. in other words, what its predictive model is, how it represents the way the world works. And so what we added was this third equation here, in which explains where affect fits in relation to all of that. And the crucial thing is this quantity here, which is called omega, which stands for precision. And precision has to do with degrees of uncertainty. Remember, I said this all has to do with uncertainty, modulating our behavior in states of uncertainty. And so basically how this works, this is what the reticular activating system does. This is what its contribution is to this cognitive learning process. When you have predictions about this is what I need to do in the world in order to bring about the sensory change that I expect, that is the prediction. And then there's a measure of error. To what extent did things not turn out as expected? Precision modulates it modulates the weighting, the confidence that the system has in either the error signal or in the prediction. That's what precision stands for. It means confidence. In other words, inverse uncertainty. Confidence in your prediction as opposed to confidence in the error signal. And it basically just works like this. When things are going as expected, that's good. When uncertainty prevails, that's bad. Okay, so that's pleasure and unpleasure, and it's modulated by a purely mechanistic fashion by palpating the expected error signal over the actual error signal, and then changing the confidence, changing your mind literally on the basis of unfolding events. That's what the reticular activating system does. Precision modulation is the same thing. In other words, changing statistical confidence is the same thing in statistical terms. It's the same thing in physiological terms as increasing or decreasing postsynaptic gain. The modulation of gain, the increasing or the modulation of the message passing, of the cognitive message passing through brainstem neuromodulators, the ones that the psychiatrists tinker with, has everything to do with this feeling process, feeling your way through the choices and decisions that you have to make based on how well or badly things are going. So this is how affect modulates, regulates, and causally influences cognitive processes, perception, action, and learning. So as Richard Feynman said, if you can't create it, you don't understand it. So this is a mechanism this is an equation which attempts to explain mechanistically how consciousness is causally produced. And the testing of that equation, which is what we're up to now in complicated things that I'm not going to go into because I'm at the end of my talk, is the test of whether or not we really are now in the ballpark of having a clue as to how we might solve the hard problem. So thank you very much for your attention. And as I said at the beginning, I'm really looking forward to the question and answer session, which starts now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Solms. This was really exciting to hear from you. We have, in fact, a couple of questions. Yasemin, would you like to?
There is an important question, I think, from Professor Aslan Dönmez. She is asking, what about the limbic structures? What is the possible contribution of limbic structures to consciousness? Maybe reticular activation system provides a raw affective consciousness, while limbic system provides a specific emotional contribution to consciousness.
Yes. Let me say, probably this will apply to my answer to all of the questions. This talk was so condensed that I've had to massively simplify things. And every sentence that I said, I could have elaborated into a paragraph, and each of those paragraphs could have been elaborated into a paper. So when I spoke of these arousal functions and these neuromodulatory functions, I spoke of them at the level of the brain stem because this is the absolute source, the absolute foundation of these functions. And I mentioned reticular activating system and periaqueductal gray. However, they do extend into the forebrain via these limbic circuits that you're asking about. And I mean, they extend into the forebrain in terms of the ascending arousal systems themselves, that the direct connections between reticular activating system via non-specific thalamus to cortex. That's the only aspect of it that I directly referred to in my talk. But there are also a higher level of circuitry, which is what we loosely call limbic circuitry. And there, the classical neuromodulators that I mentioned in relation to the reticular activating system, well, I mentioned just 3 of them. I mentioned noradrenaline, serotonin, and dopamine, but the same applies to histamine and acetylcholine. Those are the background neuromodulators, the absolute fundamental ones. But these limbic structures, they too operate in a modulatory arousal function, but in relation to much more specific aspects of affect. So that, for example, separation distress, one of the affects, the affect that has to do with attachment in mammals, is particularly mediated by mu opioids. Maternal care, which is another basic sort of emotion, is particularly mediated by alongside the hormone estrogen, by progesterone, prolactin, and oxytocin. So they function in the same sort of way. They are not message passing neurotransmitters. They are modulating. They modulate postsynaptic gain. In other words, they increase or decrease the chances of messages being passed, but in relation to specific categories of affect. But the general principles apply. They too are arousal systems in relation to specific categories of affect, rather than in relation to affectivity in general. So thanks, that was an important question. I'm glad that you gave me the opportunity to elaborate that point.
Thank you for your answer. There is another question here. When the expected state is negative due to early trauma, how does the system then look? With chronic early trauma, experiences are mainly negative. Is the setting point different for these individuals? It is this participants' experience that such individuals stay at negative implicit affective state as an equilibrium, resist moving towards a positive state, resist in the sense of not learning.
So yes, let us go back to the basic points that I was making about what affect is for. Affect is for predicting. We are born with innate reflexes and instincts, and they're very crude. They're overly generalized. Then we each of us born into a particular environmental niche where things are adjusted according to which environment we find ourselves in. And so we supplement these innate mechanisms, these reflexes and instincts, with our own individualized predictions based on our own individualized experience in the actual niche in which we find ourselves. Now, unfortunately, some of us find ourselves in safer environments than others. If you find yourself in an environment where fear mechanisms, in other words, the prediction of dangerous situations you need to upregulate your fearfulness. Or if you're born into a situation in which there is not the ordinary expected caregiving, then you have to upregulate your separation distress. In other words, you have to expect more. You place more confidence in the prediction that I'm going to be abandoned or I'm going to be attacked. And these are what we call fear and panic disorders. The traumatized person is traumatized. They have learned to expect that things are going to go wrong in one or another of the two ways that I just explained. And look, I'm again just simplifying, using just these two examples. So the expecting of that things are going wrong is an adaptive mechanism. Unfortunate, and this gives rise to the negative affect. In other words, the deviation is all the more, the bounds have been shifted on the basis of learning, and so the predicted action is, I need to escape, or I need to seek reunion more readily, and so the negative affects are generated more readily. Now, on the average, that's a good thing. Those things lead to better outcomes in terms of the basic survival mechanisms that these functions evolved for. The downside, of course, is that we then get, because of critical periods, these things are not equally plastic throughout life. And also because of the ways in which these different affective memory systems work, they don't all work in the same way. Like, for example, in learning who to attach to, the human infant, it takes up to 6 months before you have an attachment, and then you get separation anxiety and stranger anxiety and so on. Whereas in the case of fear conditioning, it's a single exposure, one experience. So attachment bonding and fear conditioning are very different types of learning. But what they both have in common, attachment happens during the first 6 months, and fear happens in a flash like this. What they both have in common is that they then become very hard to forget. You know what we say about non-declarative memory systems, hard to learn and hard to forget. In the case of attachment, not so hard to learn, but hard to forget in the case of fear. Hard to forgetness is what non-declarative memory systems have in common. And in the first 2 years of life, what we learn during those first 2 years, all of it is non-declarative. So it's very difficult to shift these things once they have been laid down. The whole of psychotherapy is what can we do about that? What I've just described, in other words, that there are these changes in the predictive model, which are non-declarative. In other words, they become fixed for all of the good biological adaptive reasons that I've described. How can we override that? How can we use our declarative memory systems to override these non-declarative mechanisms is what psychotherapy is all about. But I hope I've been able to account for the negative, the unfortunate negative phenomena that you mentioned in relation to this general theoretical scheme.
Okay, thank you. And another question. The cortex is the seat of consciousness, but what about the role of thalamus with respect to affective consciousness?
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you were saying.
The question is from Barış Korkmaz. Cortex is the seat of unconsciousness with respect to affective consciousness, the role of thalamus. That's the first question. And the role of language, the second question. And the third, how do you correlate affective consciousness in the human being with the one in the cat?
So the second part of the question is easier to answer than the first. The basics of affective consciousness are actually remarkably similar in us and in cats. This Jaak Panksepp, whose work I've mentioned a few times during this meeting, he showed really comprehensively that the basic circuitry, both brainstem and limbic, that I was asked about in the first question, that underpins the natural kinds of emotion and other bodily affects, but you're asking about emotion. It applies all the more to bodily affects, but even the emotions, the basic natural kinds, the circuitry and chemistry and basic behavioral phenotypes are the same in all mammals. So cats have fear, cats have separation distress, cats have nurture and care, the cats have lust, cats have anger, and cats have play, and cats have what we call seeking. And so do we. And the circuitry is basically the same. The connectivity is basically the same. The chemistry is basically the same in us and in cats and dogs and whatnot. Now, you ask about the role of the thalamus and the role of language in relation to affective and cognitive consciousness. And I'm answering your question in this back to front way because it's these aspects, the language aspects and the cognitive aspects of consciousness, that's obviously where we differ from cats and dogs and horses and cows and other mammals who all share this basic emotional circuitry. Our capacity to re-represent all of this reflexively, to think reflectively about our affects, to label them with words, and to do cognitive gymnastics with them, all of which are not small things and play a very big part in thinking. And thinking is also not a small thing. It's the ability to not just, everything I described in my talk has to do with trial and error. You know, you've got to try this and try that. Thinking enables you to imagine it all, to not actually have to do it, and to in the safety of thought, you know, to be able to feel your way still, but feeling your way through imaginative cognition, all of it greatly facilitated by language, to be able to abstract yourself from a situation, to solve it at the abstract level, which is even better than concretely thinking about one or another possible virtual reality, which is what that kind of episodic sort of thinking is all for. So that's how we differ from these other creatures. And that has everything to do, as I say, with the cognitive type of consciousness, and language has so much to do with that. You ask about the role of the thalamus. Well, the arousal systems, the reticular arousal systems that I spoke about earlier, the fact that you asked the question probably suggests you don't need me to tell you that they go via what we very loosely call non-specific thalamic nuclei. They are relay stations, just as the specific thalamic nuclei are relay stations of externally sourced inputs, the error signals that I was talking about in that little diagram at the end. So the affect, the actual precision modulation, the modulation of gain in physiological terms, that comes from the reticular activating system via these non-specific thalamic relays to cortex. So that's where the thalamus fits into that. Language, of course, is an entirely cortical process. And what I'm saying implicit in what I've just said is that arousal process, which, you know, most of us outside of affective neuroscience and neuropsychoanalysis, you know, we think about that arousal process as some kind of quantity. What I'm saying is that arousing of cortex by these non-specific thalamic relays, that arousing of cortex is in fact the palpating of cognition with affect. It's the feeling of your way through the cognitive processing, which otherwise would not have to be conscious. So the arousal, the activation, the rendering conscious of those processes is the feeling of them. You feel your way into your cognitions. I hope that that's not too much of a ramble in terms of trying to answer your penetrating questions. Thank you.
Thanks for your reply, Mark. Professor Korkmaz adds to his question and he says, but do you equate awakeness with affective consciousness?
Yes, I don't think it's possible. I said that briefly in my talk, so I welcome the opportunity to underscore it, to repeat it. The idea of a blank wakefulness, a contentless wakefulness, a qualitative, a qualityless wakefulness, it makes no sense to me. So for me, the word wakefulness, what we call wakefulness, I think that it is the same thing as arousal, and I prefer the word arousal because arousal has more of a kind of the quality of affect. I think that it is affective, it's intrinsically affective. It is, cortex, when you're asleep, cortex is the forebrain and cognitive machinery is processing information all the time. As you possibly know, it's not processing as much of the external sensory world, but it's processing a hell of a lot offline in terms of the remembered events of the day. So there's a lot of cognition going on, but except during dreaming, it goes on unconsciously. The palpating of these processes through this process called wakefulness, this arousing of it all, and you coming back into being, you, this experiencing subject, is the feeling of your way back into now a much more uncertain situation as you enter the new day. So yes, for me, wakefulness is impossible without affect. For me, they are the same thing. The sentient subject is literally constituted of affect.
May I share a brief comment and then ask the question of Professor Atalay? It's a great talk, and you highly persuaded us that affective consciousness lays in the brainstem, and it's really superior than the cortex in terms of consciousness. And the line that you drew, and when you started talking about Friston and how he reduced this mechanism into mathematics, as a clinician, as a psychotherapist, instinctively, I felt distressed because I see no effects on that diagram, no affective balance like positive emotions and negative emotions, like positive predictions and negative predictions. Nor I see object relations, like a narcissistic personality disorder can have a positive prediction about himself, but negative predictions about others. Or a depressive personality disorder person can have very negative predictions about himself or herself and very positive predictions about others. So in that diagram, I feel lost in terms of affective balance and object relations. That's just a brief comment as a clinician, but up until Friston, we are highly persuaded about the hidden springs location in the brainstem. And very related to my question, actually, maybe very related to my instincts, Professor Hakan Atalay has a question. He says, provided that we have formulas for the operation of the brain, can we easily make artificial brains now?
So this will probably be the last two questions because they're going to need quite a bit of answering. The first of the two questions, I'm painfully aware of what you experienced. You're not the first clinician colleague to say, look, Mark, we really follow you until that point, and then we lose you. Or, then you start to feel like you're on the other side.
We don't lose you, actually. We lose the feeling of safety.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I really can understand that. Now, remember that I squeezed into 5 minutes there, really just trying to make the point that if we are seriously claiming that we understand the causal mechanism of feeling, then we should be able to reduce it to a natural, scientific, lawful, causal, mechanistic process. And I was trying to just make the point in principle that in that general direction, that's the direction that we have to go in order to be able to do that. You saw when I spoke of precision there, I spoke about it as if it were one quantity. I'd already said earlier that, in fact, you can't reduce affects to a common denominator. So precision has to, in fact, be categorized across the different multiple needs. And then you start speaking about, so free energy, which is the common denominator in the equations that I showed you there, that has to be compartmentalized across the different affects. That's where the valence is, goodness or badness. Increasing free energy is bad. In other words, increasing errors is bad, and decreasing errors is good. So I said things going as expected, that's good. Uncertainty prevails, that's bad. But then there's qualities of goodness and badness across the different affects, the different categories of affect. I didn't have time to extrapolate all of that, but it does. That is how it works. So that there are feelings which with different qualities, like you spoke about different feelings in relation to different emotional disorders. So depression is different from anxiety, for example, is different from anger management problems. So these categories of this mechanism are the basic stuff of emotional experience, which is what the disorders that we treat are all about. So let me try to put it in a sort of a simple formulation, that each of those feelings is a homeostat. In other words, there's somewhere where we need to be, like in relation to fear. We need to be safe. If there's a deviation from that, then we feel fear, and then we have to predict what to do in order to get back to safety. When it comes to separation distress, we need to be close to our loved ones. If we're separated from them, or worse still, we lose them, which is what panic and despair are all about. That's a problem for the mind, and we need to find predictions as to how to get back, how to establish reunion, or how to re-find a loving object. Rage is a deviate. We need to not have frustrating obstacles impeding us from getting to to our objects. And if they do, it irritates us and frustrates us and enrages us. And we have to have predictions of how do we get back. So the basic structure of psychopathology is the feelings our patients suffer from is which of these needs is not being met. In other words, which of these deviations from our viable bounds is the patient, in which one of those categories have they not learned how to meet their needs? I mean, that's how you can put it. And each of these are intrinsically object relational, so that I just described a caregiving object relationship, a safety providing, and this is a paranoid object, the object that I fear. This is an attachment object, the object that I'm attached to. This is a frustrating object, the object of rage, and so on. So these are intrinsically object relational, and it helps us to understand the natural kinds of emotion that underlie our patients' difficulties, the predictions that they make. Remember, I said earlier that they're not always conscious, they're largely unconscious, they're non-declarative, they're automatized. The psychotherapeutic process is a business of making the patient aware, if I can use this language, of what their predictions are. They have automatized predictions which are meant to get them back to where they need to be feeling-wise, and they're not working. So the therapeutic task is to make the patient aware, you're doing this. That's what transference interpretation is about. This is what you do when you find yourself in that situation. It's meant to achieve this outcome, but it isn't. That's problematizing it. That's how that makes the possibility of change. So all of this can be mapped onto psychopathologies and onto our basic task as psychotherapists. I just didn't have time to unpack all of that. And still now, even now, it's not enough time. But now, last comment is in terms of artificial consciousness, which speaks in a completely different direction. That's the main purpose of my work with Friston was to make possible if these genuinely are the mechanisms whereby the elementary form of consciousness, namely feeling, is generated, then we must be able to engineer it. That's why I quoted Richard Feynman saying, if I can't create it, I don't understand it. If you really know how it works, you should be able to produce it. And so we are in fact involved in a very heartfelt attempt. I'm working with physicists and computer scientists and biomedical engineers and so on, a team of us working on trying to do exactly that, to make an artificial, and please note, not a brain, to make an artificial form of feeling in an artificial agent. It's fascinating work, fraught with difficulties. I don't have time to go into all of that. The ethics of all of that, I just want to flag up, is terribly, terribly important. But we're making good progress with it. And we're progressing that research program precisely so that we can own it and make sure that the way, when I say own it, I don't mean personally. We're registering our findings, the ownership of the patenting of these applications of these equations in the name of public institutions which are not owned by any one person, who are first and foremost concerned with the ethics, the ethical implications both for human beings and the ethical implications for these artificial agents. I really, sorry if I sound like a lunatic. I know
no,
I sound like a lunatic to myself at times. When I say I really do think we are on the brink of being able to engineer an artificial form of feeling. I think we're very nearly there.
And I guess you said that so many clinicians are objecting you. Maybe this was against our prediction about you. That's why we didn't expect you to work on this project, and we cannot yet process it. But time will tell, and we never thought that you're lunatic. Actually, it's really interesting.
It goes against my predictions about myself too. I never would have thought that I would be doing things like this in my old age, but that's what I'm doing.
Gamze?
Well, we have 3 more questions, but do we have the time? Professor Solms?
Oh, well, I think I have time for one more question. I'm afraid I have another meeting that I have to go to, but I am in fact already a few minutes late, but I didn't know there were more questions. So let's take one more question and then we better end.
Okay, so we have to choose. Please, Gökçe, you choose which question.
I know, Yasemin, can you read now? Fırat İlim.
One of them is really...
Rosita Morlevi Menda.
It is the last one. One is from Maggie Zellner and the other one's from Fırat İlim.
Yes, I think Mark has already answered the question coming from Maggie Zellner. She also had a comment that she wrote, this way of thinking about affect and consciousness has enriched my clinical work recently. It's a new way of thinking about many concepts that are already part of our psychoanalytic theory and technique. And she continues. So maybe we could take the question from Fırat İlim. Yasemin.
Yes. Okay. He asked that Freud argued that his topological model had no reference to any physiological location. I would be grateful to hear if you agree with him or can mention any specific physiological locations, especially about where and how suppression happens.
So Freud said that for the present, he said, his functional architecture of the mind has no anatomical referent. But I need to point out that because many psychoanalysts overlook the fact that he's saying that for now, but then he says in many places, and in future we will have to find a point of contact. what Freud was actually a pioneer of what we now call cognitive science in this functionalist approach, where he said, you know, what we don't have to dissect the organ, we need to dissect the function. And that the function doesn't reside in narrow anatomical structures. It's as it were dispersed between those structures. Sorry, my phone is telling me I'm late for that meeting. So you know, that's an advanced way of thinking. Freud's topographical model, functionalist thinking, and the reason I'm saying that this is commonplace now in cognitive science is that it is far from being incompatible with a neurological way of thinking, where you then map these dynamic functional systems back onto dynamically onto the anatomy and physiology of the brain. And that's what we've been doing sort of, you know, progressively since the 1950s, 1960s, exponentially in the last decades of the 20th century. So Freud would be very happy for us to now be relating his topographical model back to anatomy. He actually started the process himself. If you read, I haven't got chapter and verse here with me, but he says in many different places that the perceptual systems, what he later called the system perceptual consciousness, he says these are cortical systems. He says it in many different places. And he equates, for example, in the ego and the id, he equates the perceptual system with the cortical homunculus. So in that one way, he was willing to localize and to link back to anatomy. So now you're asking me, can we do that now? My answer is yes. And I wrote a paper. It's in the journal Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, 2017. And it's called, What is the Unconscious and Where is it Located in the Brain? So Solms, 2017, What is the Unconscious and Where is it Located in the Brain? Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. There's my answer to your question. You'd have to read that. You said, and specifically in relation to depression, which is a huge leap beyond just the topographical model to a specific psychopathology. So for that, again, all I can do is refer you to a paper that I wrote on this topic. I wrote a paper with Jaak Panksepp on this topic. In other words, the anatomy and physiology of depression. In other words, a specific instance of this general thing that we are now in progress to be able to do. And that paper was called Why Depression Feels Bad. But you'll have to just Google it. It's Solms and Panksepp, Why Depression Feels Bad. I can't even remember where we published it, but Google it. It's there in the virtual sphere of the internet. Solms and Panksepp, Why Depression Feels Bad. It goes into all of that. I really have to go. I'm sorry. My understanding was that we were going to end 10 minutes ago, and I'm getting
we
urgent.
Kept you so long. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being here, and I'm looking forward to being there in person. Hopefully in the not too distant future.
Yeah, hopefully,
Thanks.
Mark. We thank
Thanks.
you a lot for accepting our invite again and joining us in a beautiful Istanbul evening. So it might be maybe afternoon in the States, and I don't know the time zone in other continents. However, we really enjoyed your talk a lot, and it was a fruitful event for all of us. I also thank to all the collaborators for this event and all the participants for their wonderful comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, my
Greetings
dear
to Cape
friend
Town.
Gretchen.